Building a home in the US is getting more and more expensive every day, and prices for existing homes are currently near the highest they have been ever, raising 30% since 2020 and 43% since 2015. In this video, we'll talk about what's behind these increases in costs and where prices are headed, so stick around. Building a home can be a very expensive proposition. You have the cost of materials like lumber, concrete, copper wire, drywall, and insulation, among other things. Not to mention the cost of labor that goes into putting all of it together. The price of everything has gone up substantially in the past few years. In fact, in 2021, the cost of the raw materials needed to construct a home went up by 14.6%. And in 2022, costs went up by 15%. That is nearly 30% higher in just 2 years. The cost to buy an existing home has also gone up by about 30% in that same time frame. So what's behind it all? Well, first things first, let's talk about the pandemic. Now, we all know the logistics failures and the supply chain issues that took place a few years back, and that definitely had an impact on the availability and therefore the price of commodities, especially those that are shipped internationally. But while a lot of those supply chain issues and challenges have actually been dealt with and have dissipated by now, the cost of many of the raw materials that go into new homes have not come down. And here are just a few examples. First, there's concrete, and then we've got copper, which is used for electrical wire, and then there is the price of gypsum used for sheetrock, and then the price of steel. Now, we'll delve into each of those in just a moment, but before we get into that, let's just talk about what I think is perhaps the most impactful legacy of the pandemic overall, and that is how people and society in general shifted away from cities. It's what's called domestic migration. And here's a really interesting map from the US Census Bureau that shows what happened. The red in this map shows areas that lost population, and the blue shows areas that gained population. Nearly every metro area in the country, with a few exceptions, lost population. And where did all those people go? Well, they went to the suburbs or the outskirts of major cities or to rural areas. That led to a run on housing in those areas. And that demand led to increases in both rents and home prices in those rural and suburban areas. And when there's an increase in the demand for something and the supply can't keep up, that's when we get higher prices. And I'm curious what all of you have seen in the areas where you live. Is this something that you have witnessed firsthand? Has your hometown been inundated by people moving away from cities? Or maybe you live in a city and you've seen people move out. Or maybe you yourself moved. Leave me a comment and let me know what you're seeing and where you're located so we can understand what's going on. Now, I've read stories from people in places all over, as diverse as rural Pennsylvania and Montana, as well as parts of Texas. And I've heard people complain about this. Basically, locals are getting priced out of their own hometown. And here's the crazy thing. You would expect that at some point that would have changed when the COVID shutdowns ended. But a lot of those people decided that they liked it in the rural parts of the country and in the suburbs, and so they stayed. And one of the biggest challenges now is that new homes are not being built fast enough to account for both the transplants and the hometown folks who want to buy houses in those areas. And that again leads to higher prices. Now, it seems like the solution would be to just build more homes, and that would certainly help in some ways. It would certainly ease the supply crunch. But there is a problem, and that is that even if we build more homes, those homes would still cost more because the raw materials, things like copper and sheetrock and concrete, are more expensive. Again, we'll talk more about that in a moment, but before we get there, there's one really important thing that we need to consider, and that is the cost of labor. Now, generally the cost of labor goes up gradually, and you can see that in this graph here of labor costs for all non-farm workers from the year 2000 to 2020. The cost of labor went up during that time by an average of about 1.2% per year, but from 2020 to 2024, costs went up by over 15%, which is almost 4% per year for those years. Now, this graph actually includes a lot and goes far beyond just construction workers to include all non-farm workers. But there are some other factors that impact the trades more specifically. For example, there is an aging workforce of professional tradespeople that is not being replaced by younger workers. Some estimates put the average age of master plumbers at around 58 years old. And other trades like carpenters, electricians, and others will have mass numbers of people retiring in the near future without enough younger people to replace them. Now, I could go on and on about that, but I actually made a video a while back talking about this very point. And so if you want to hear more about that, you can check out the link here. But the point that I'm making now is that the number of these tradespeople is going down, and the demand for their labor is going up. And what do we have when supply drops and demand goes up? Higher prices. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Labor costs have gone up significantly. So those are a few of the things that are going on in the market as a whole, but let's get into some of the specific building materials that are so expensive at the moment. Let's start with concrete. So here is a graph of concrete prices over the past 10 years or so. You can see that the prices for concrete, like most things, are always increasing slightly, usually in line with inflation. But from 2020 to now, there's been an increase of over 47%. So what is going on here? Like most everything, the pandemic took its toll and there were shutdowns at large limestone quarries and factories, as well as shortages of truck drivers and other things. But the truth is actually more complicated and can't necessarily be tied to one specific thing. But what's really important to understand is that there was actually cement shortage in 2022. Now, cement is the main ingredient for concrete, and it's a complex product to produce. It takes inputs of raw materials like limestone, gypsum, and clay, which is then ground to a powder and heated and combined with other additives. It's not easy to do, and in 2022, cement factories were not able to keep up with the demand at the time. That reduced the supply and led to price increases, and they haven't come down since. Now, in order for those prices to come down, at least one of two things has to happen. Either the demand for cement needs to come down, or the supply for cement needs to go up. Neither of those things sound very likely to me, and so I don't see cement and concrete prices coming down anytime soon. So what about other raw materials? Well, like I mentioned before, copper wire is another big component in building, as copper wire is used to wire homes for electrical, as well as for appliances and other electronics. Copper is interesting because it's an international commodity, meaning that if there's a lot of building going on in one part of the world, the cost of copper will go up everywhere. So here is a graph of copper prices over the past 10 years. Now, what's interesting here is that unlike the cement graph, there have been many more ups and downs. But over this time, copper is still up 32%. Now, here's the thing about copper. It's hard to get copper, and nearly 40% of the world's supply comes from only a handful of mines in Chile and Peru. So copper is easily susceptible to shortages or shocks in supply or demand. In fact, let's actually take a longer view of copper because it's really interesting. This graph right here shows copper prices since the year 2000. And you can see this huge increase starting in around 2005 and 2006. During that time, prices went up by 300%, which was due mainly to the huge construction boom that took place in China at that time. Later, there was a crash and then a quick recovery around the time of the housing crisis. But the point here is that copper is volatile. And so the future price of copper here again depends upon supply and demand. And I don't see demand for copper coming down anytime soon. All right, let's do a few quick ones. Sheetrock. Sheetrock's main component is gypsum. Gypsum is a material that can be mined, but can also be produced in a factory. And here is a graph of gypsum prices since 2000. Now, I'm not sure why there is a gap in the data here, but what you can clearly see is that gypsum prices are sky high. Again, it's all about supply and demand. Steel is another input into building new homes, and here's a graph of steel prices for the last 10 years. Steel was relatively stable pre-pandemic, but it shot up. The good news is that steel prices have actually come down from their highs. But that said, prices in 2024 are still 78% higher than prices in 2020. The last commodity that I'm going to talk about is lumber. Now, I actually talk a lot about lumber on this channel. If you've been here before, you know that. So I'm going to be brief here, and I'll actually link my last video on lumber prices if you want to check that out and know more about what's going on. But I do want to show this graph of lumber prices. This is lumber prices for the past 10 years. Now, this one looks very different from the others. Lumber experienced huge increases in price during the pandemic, like a lot of things. But as you can see here, those prices have actually dropped significantly. Now, that doesn't mean the cost of all lumber is down, as sheet goods, things like plywood, are still easily double what they were pre-pandemic. But framing lumber is actually very close to pre-pandemic prices in most of the country. So what does all of this mean? Well, prices for most construction materials are up. And without some sort of supply and or demand shock, I don't see prices really coming down at all in the near term. But there is a silver lining, and for that I have one more graph. This is a graph of all of the inputs to residential construction minus energy. And while you can see that prices went up 14.6% in 2021 and 15% in 2022, prices in 2023 and 2024 have gone up by less than 3%, or around 1.5% per year. That is a much more reasonable increase and seems to indicate that the huge jumps that we've seen in expenses over the past couple of years are likely over, and we're only going to see small, normal increases going forward in the future, at least in the near term. So while the good news is that costs seem to have calmed down and we likely won't see huge one-time increases like we did in the past, the bad news, of course, is that costs of building a home are still up 30% from a few years ago. This not only makes new homes being built more expensive, but will also make older homes more expensive as the cost of replacement is higher. And while increasing home values can be good for people who already own homes, it can also cause problems such as higher insurance costs or higher property taxes. And high prices for new homes can definitely make it difficult for first-time home buyers to get into a home. That's a whole other topic for another video, and we'll get to that at some point. But I'm really interested in what you guys are seeing. How have property values changed where you live? How have the increases in construction costs impacted you and your community? Leave me a comment and let me know what's going on. Thanks for watching. Hit that like button and check out this video talking all about the crisis in the skilled trades, or this video talking about the latest in lumber prices, and I'll see you in the next one.